Morning light crept through the tall arched windows of the Wells estate, painting soft golden streaks across the cool marble floors. The house, nestled in Napa Valley's elite enclave, was more than just a home. It was an architectural statement. Whitewashed walls, coffered ceilings with baccarat crystal chandeliers, velvet French armchairs and hand-woven Italian wool rugs under a Roche Bobboy coffee table completed the illusion of quiet perfection. Eliza Harper, now Eliza Wells, stood still by the window, her fingers curled gently around a Versace porcelain coffee cup rimmed with 24K gold. The coffee had long gone cold. She wore a Hermes silk robe in soft champagne, its fabric cascading down like liquid luxury. Her hair was pinned into a low, neat bun. A few wisps fell against her cheek. No makeup, but a face carved in elegant restraint. She was the picture of grace and illusion. To the world, Eliza's life was enviable. Wealthy, sophisticated, secure, she was the wife of Graham Wells, a celebrated tech CEO dubbed Silicon Valley's Prince by Fortune magazine. They graced red carpets together, he in Tom Ford tuxedos, she in Eliza or Valentino gowns, always poised, always perfect, like a couple straight out of a curated dream. But Eliza knew behind the curated image was a marriage hollowed out by distance. The fiery love that once kept them up all night talking had faded into a silent script they both recited without emotion. The man who once drew diagrams of their future on napkins now whispered only to investors and phones, not to her. Back then, they had eaten instant noodles in a studio above a ramen shop. She edited his pitch decks in red ink, cheered him on after every rejection. She even sold her first car to help fund his startup. They had nothing, but they had each other. Now she had everything, except the man she gave everything for. Graham still wore custom Zegna suits and Audemars Piguet on his wrist, drove a Tesla Model S Plaid, but he came home late, distracted, terse, and always, with a faint scent of Clive Christian perfume clinging to his collar. Eliza didn't ask anymore, not because she didn't care, but because she'd grown used to the silence, the kind that doesn't shout, but bruises slowly. At first, Eliza told herself it was just work stress. Graham's company had just closed a major Series C round and was preparing for its IPO. His days were filled with investor calls, board meetings, and sudden overseas trips to Tokyo, Berlin, Tel Aviv. She reminded herself, this is what it takes to build an empire. I have to be patient. But the more her mind tried to understand, the more her heart felt alone. Graham started coming home later and later, sometimes at 10, sometimes not at all. His phone was always face down. When it rang, he stepped out of the room, voice hushed and tense. There was a new perfume on his shirt collar, one Eliza didn't recognize. His eyes were different too. Not guilty, just distant. Eliza didn't scream, didn't accuse. She just observed, like someone watching a fire that once warmed her, now burning out. Slow and irreversible, the pain no longer stabbed. It had calloused over. Until the night of the gala. It was the annual literacy charity event, something Eliza had poured months of planning into. As a former elementary school teacher, this cause was her heart's work. That night, she wore a deep emerald green gown, the same color she wore on their first date. A quiet hope flickered. Maybe he would remember. But he didn't see her. Graham arrived in a custom tuxedo, confident and composed. But his gaze wasn't for his wife. It was for someone else. Savannah Rhodes, 26 years old, a social media darling and rising fashion model. Young, magnetic, trained in how to tilt her head just right for the camera. Eliza spotted them near the champagne fountain. Savannah laughed, her head tilted toward Graham's shoulder. His hand rested gently on her lower back, casual, familiar. Eliza watched from across the room, wine glass in hand, her smile perfect, posture poised. And inside, everything collapsed without making a sound. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Wednesday evening, Graham came home early, unusually early. He didn't take off his coat, didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the living room, like a man heading into battle. "Eliza, I think we've grown apart," he began, eyes fixed anywhere but hers. "I feel like we've both changed." Eliza sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she asked, voice steady. Too steady. Graham's silence was louder than any confession. He left on a Friday afternoon, just 2 days after that quiet, devastating conversation. When he said they had become different people, and his eyes flickered away from hers like dodging an emotional debt. He didn't promise to come back, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply packed his things, left his favorite watch on the kitchen counter, and walked out, as if punctuation was unnecessary when the silence said everything. Eliza didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't chase. She simply nodded, closed the door, and let the stillness begin to take up residence in every corner of their once shared home. The next morning, the doorbell rang. A man in a pressed navy suit handed her a large ivory envelope, legal grue heavy paper. Her name printed on the top corner in all caps, Wells v. Harper, petition for dissolution of marriage. There was no note, no text, no last look. She sat on the hardwood floor of the living room, the envelope spread before her like an open wound. In the same house where they once planned to raise a family, Eliza realized she had become a ghost in her own life. Days slowed. Hours bled into each other. She didn't leave the house for almost a week. Meals went cold, coffee sat untouched, and her body moved through the rooms without purpose. Nights were longer without the echo of Graham's footsteps or the glow of his office lamp. What remained was a quiet so sharp it almost felt like pain. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, as she bent down to retrieve a package on the front step, the world spun. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and everything went black. She woke up in the ER. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sterile and cold. An IV dripped rhythmically into her arm. The first sensation wasn't pain, it was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that comes only when you've already lost too much to fear losing more. The door creaked open. A woman in a white coat entered. Soft features, kind eyes. In her hand, she carried a black and white ultrasound printout. "Miss Harper?" she asked, smiling gently. "I'm Dr. Ruiz." Eliza barely nodded. Her lips were cracked, dry. "I passed out from exhaustion, right?" "Yes and no," Dr. Ruiz replied. "You're severely malnourished, but the primary reason is something else. Something inside your body is growing fast." She held up the ultrasound. "You're pregnant." A breathless laugh escaped Eliza's lips, sharp, dry. "That's not possible. It was just once. After the IPO." The doctor nodded. Once was enough. The room felt suddenly airless. "There are 5 heartbeats," she continued gently, turning the screen toward Eliza. She froze. 5? Yes. You're carrying quintuplets." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They rearranged everything, silently, instantly. They kept her overnight for observation. The hospital room was dim and quiet, separated from the outside world by a thin curtain and the dull hum of machines. Eliza lay still, cocooned in blankets, the weight of what she had learned pressing into her chest. She placed her hand over her stomach, still flat, still untouched by any visible sign, but something inside her already felt different, alive. She didn't call Graham, not out of anger, but out of clarity. She knew what would happen. The moment he knew, it wouldn't just be her story anymore. The children would become press fodder, assets, scandal, bargaining chips in a war of images and reputation. And Eliza refused to let that happen. She turned to her side, curling into herself, her eyes wide open, staring not at the ceiling but beyond it, as if trying to glimpse what lay ahead. For the first time in weeks, a tear rolled down her cheek, not for what she had lost, but for what she had just found. And as she whispered into the quiet, the words weren't a declaration, they were a vow. "I'm not alone anymore." Eliza returned home on a gray afternoon. No one waited at the door. There were no arms to fall into, no tearful voices saying how worried they'd been, only the house, vast and still, as if it too understood that its owner was no longer the same woman. She walked slowly down the long hallway, past the bare wall where wedding portraits once hung. She had taken them down the day Graham left. Not out of spite, but because they no longer spoke to her. The wall stood blank now, like her life, a canvas waiting to be repainted from nothing. She sat on the bedroom floor and opened her laptop. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the first words. Day 1. I don't know how to begin, but I will try. If anyone out there feels lost right now, maybe you need to hear this. You are not alone. Eliza started an anonymous blog, no photo, no name. She called it Strong Enough. Each post was a window into her new world, the nausea, the ultrasounds done alone, the fear of every new test result, the quiet victories, like buying the right prenatal vitamins without crying in the pharmacy aisle, or holding her breath and feeling the faintest flutter beneath her skin. Slowly, readers appeared. First, a woman from Portland, abandoned while pregnant, then a single mom from Boston, a nurse from Atlanta. They emailed stories, gratitude, words of encouragement. They became flickers of light in Eliza's longest night. Money began to dry up. Though Graham's legal settlement looked fair on paper, it barely covered the rising costs of a high-risk pregnancy. Specialists, nutritional plans, appointments every week. Every day became a math problem she had to solve to survive. Eliza chose to turn her blog into a source of income. She hosted live webinars on financial survival post-divorce, on navigating insurance as a single parent, on rebuilding after abandonment. As a former school teacher, she had the skills. As a betrayed woman, she had the story. She recorded videos with her phone balanced on a stack of books. No makeup, no editing, just her oversized sweaters, maternity leggings, and a voice that no longer trembled. She closed all joint bank accounts, reclaimed her documents under the name Harper, switched to filtered water instead of bottled, learned to meal prep with pregnancy-safe ingredients. She hired a part-time doula with her blog income, barely enough, but enough. As the babies began to move more, she learned to recognize their rhythms. That's Jason, she'd smile, listening to the monitor. And that's Leanna. She kicks harder than the rest. No one visited, no one called, but Eliza didn't want pity. She needed resilience. And day by day, night by night, she was forging herself into steel. Eliza was sitting in front of her laptop when it began. The sky had just begun to lighten. California was still cloaked in soft gray, and the early morning sun hadn't yet broken through the thick clouds. She sat alone in the silent kitchen, wrapped in a wool shawl, her belly stretched tight beneath a soft knit sweater. One hand rested lightly on her stomach, the other hovered over the keyboard. She was writing a new blog post titled, "Fear is not the end." She didn't even finish the second sentence. The first contraction hit like a blade, sharp, clean, and unmistakable. It didn't feel like the Braxton Hicks she'd read about. It was something deeper, more commanding, as though her entire lower body had been seized by an invisible force. Eliza exhaled sharply, biting down on a cry. Then she felt it, a rush of warm fluid between her legs. Her body understood before her brain could catch up. They were coming. The doula answered the call on the first ring. 10 minutes later, she was at Eliza's side, her calm hands checking vitals, her voice brisk but steady. "We need to get you to the hospital, now." The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the stillness of dawn. Eliza lay strapped to the gurney, gripping the doula's hand. Her skin was damp with sweat, her breath short and calculated. "You okay?" the EMT asked. Eliza shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I'm ready." The operating room was a different world. Bright white light beamed down from surgical lamps. Machines surrounded her, beeping and blinking. 5 neon natal teams were stationed, one for each baby. Dr. Ruiz, who had been by her side throughout the pregnancy, stood ready to lead. Eliza was transferred to the delivery table, her arms strapped gently into padded rests. her face pale but her eyes wide open. "I'm here, Eliza," Dr. Ruiz said, her voice calm and grounded. "They're early, but we're ready." Eliza nodded weakly. She didn't think about risks, didn't let her mind touch the what-ifs. She thought only of the names she had written in her notebook, and the surgery began. The first, a boy, was born at 8:04 a.m. A thin but determined cry filled the air the moment he emerged. Eliza's eyes welled with tears, not fear, but awe. The NICU team moved swiftly, wiping, checking vitals, inserting breathing tubes. A nurse leaned toward her. "He's doing well, he's stable." The second, a girl, came at 8:07. She didn't cry, she didn't move. The team didn't panic, but urgency rippled through the room. The baby was rushed to the NICU table in silence. Eliza stared at the ceiling, frozen, breath held. 30 seconds, 45, a minute. Then a soft whimper. Then a cry, weak but there. The room breathed again. The third and fourth, another boy and girl, arrived at 8:12 and 8:14. Both were smaller than expected. Their cries were faint, more like sighs. But they came, alive, fragile, but fighting. Each heartbeat thudded in Eliza's chest like a drum. She blinked tears down her temples onto the surgical table. And then came the last, Leanna, the tiniest of the five, 8:19 a.m. No sound, no movement, her tiny limbs pale, still. Dr. Ruiz's expression tightened. A nurse hit the alert button. 2 NICU doctors stepped in, beginning emergency procedures. No one said anything to Eliza. They didn't need to. Her body knew. A second, 2, 3. Eliza prayed, truly prayed, for the first time in years. And then, a sound, thin, fragile. A cry stretched like thread, but real. She had only been given partial anesthesia. She was awake. And yet the moment afterward blurred into something dreamlike. Blinking through tears, she realized she had survived. And so had they. Hours later, in the recovery room, a nurse brought her 5 photographs, glossy, fresh from the printer. 5 newborns, tiny as water bottles, each encased in an incubator, tubes in their noses, paper-thin skin glowing under the NICU lights. Eliza held each photo in her hand. Not one of them looked the same, and yet each of them was part of her. She opened her journal and wrote their names again. Jason, Malia, Tomaz, Ella, Liana. 5 names, 5 beginnings, 5 reasons she would never break again. The world didn't pause for Eliza to recover. Just 3 days after surgery, she was already sitting upright. Not able to stand for long, but learning to live with the sensation of fire-lace stitches pulling at her skin. Every step throbbed, but she didn't complain, didn't whimper. She kept her eyes fixed on the NICU hallway, where 5 tiny lives lay in plastic cribs, tangled in tubes, fighting every second to stay. Eliza was allowed to visit twice a day. Each time, she scrubbed her hands for 3 full minutes, put on a gown, gloves, mask. She couldn't hold them, but she could slip one finger through the incubator hatch. And when one of those miniature hands wrapped around her finger, she knew every pain was worth it. A week later, she went home, not to the old mansion, but to a modest apartment she'd rented, using what she had left from online consultations. When she opened the door, the smell of new paint lingered. The rooms were empty except for a floor mattress, a small desk, and a few unopened boxes. But in the nursery, something waited. 5 tiny cribs, assembled by readers of her blog strong enough. There were pillows, cotton blankets, preemie diapers, bedtime books, and even a bottle warmer. Someone had left a handwritten note. "You don't know me, but I was once where you are now. Keep going, Mama." Eliza stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't cry. She just breathed. A breath that didn't carry fear anymore. Time didn't pass, it stormed. There were no longer days or nights. Milk needed pumping every 3 hours. At 4 a.m., she called the NICU to check Liana's heart rate. At 6, She was learning to use a nasal suction device for preemies. She became fluent in NICU language, ventilation settings, calorie counts, micro-preemie vaccines. She had no full-time help. The doula came 3 days a week. Everything else, from washing burp cloths to filing Medicaid forms, Eliza did alone. Still, she wrote, every night, even just 15 minutes. She updated the blog, not to vent, but to remember. She wrote about the first time she held Malaya, about the night Ella came off the ventilator, about Tomas, always the best sleeper, about Jason, who looked up at her as if asking, "Are you still here, Mama?" About Leanna, tiny, stubborn, and the first to smile. In the quiet, Eliza wasn't just raising 5 babies. She was rebuilding an entire life. 5 years, a stretch of time long enough for a life to take on a new shape, imperfect, unglamorous, but real and full in its own way. Eliza once thought the hardest part after the divorce would be the betrayal, but she was wrong. The hardest part was waking up at 3 a.m. after 4 hours of broken sleep to change diapers, mix formula, soothe 3 crying babies, and then sit back down at her laptop to respond to client emails. The hardest part was staying mentally present when she couldn't afford organic food or special formula for preemies and had to choose between paying for dinner or the electricity bill. But through all the hardest parts, Eliza learned one unshakable truth. Real love doesn't need abundance. It just needs consistency. The apartment she rented had only 2 bedrooms. She gave one to the children, 5 little beds lined up wall to wall, each with a dedicated section where they could scribble and doodle as they pleased. The walls were always smudged with crayon and tiny handprints, but to Eliza, it was the most vibrant mural she'd ever seen. There was no fancy washer-dryer. Eliza scrubbed each onesie by hand in cold water. No AC unit. During the blistering summers, she folded paper fans for each child and set bowls of ice water beside their cribs. No car. Every hospital visit required them to pile onto crowded buses, Eliza cradling one baby, backpack full of meds over her shoulder, holding Malia's hand with the other. And yet, despite the material lack, their little home had never been short on laughter. Jason, the eldest, was always the first to wake up and would whisper stories to the others. Malia, obsessed with playing doctor, ran imaginary checkups on teddy bears with a toy stethoscope. Tomas, the quiet observer, built secret Lego houses under the table and whispered to her, "Mama, our home is safe again." Ella was the artist, drawing on walls, newspaper scraps, even empty milk cartons. Every picture included Mom and 5 superhero kids. Liana, the youngest, never walked. She twirled, bounced, sang, hummed. Every step was a celebration. Evenings became sacred. After dinner, baths, and tidying up, Eliza would spread a thin mattress in the middle of the living room. She'd read aloud, not just to lull them to sleep, but to plant seeds of wonder into their dreams. When the nightlight glowed and steady little breaths filled the air, she often sat in silence with a lukewarm mug of tea, asking herself, "Was it enough? Did I miss something today?" Then she'd glance over at 5 tiny sleeping forms, each movement, each breath, and the answer was always, "Yes, I'm trying, with everything I have." Love here wasn't roses or surprises. Love was splitting her last bowl of porridge 5 ways and sipping water for dinner. Love was crying in the shower, then emerging with a soft smile and open arms. Love was pausing every personal dream to build a safe, sunlit world for 5 fragile souls. Those 5 years weren't a time of getting over it. They were years of building, out of shards, out of tears, out of breath and heartbeat. She didn't have much, but she had 5 voices calling Mama every morning. She didn't live in luxury, but she lived inside something deeper, a life, full of truth, full of love. That night, after her children had fallen asleep, Eliza finally sat down to sift through the growing stack of mail on her table. Amidst insurance forms and grocery flyers, a thick, gold-trimmed envelope stood out. She opened it, Her eyes scanned the printed text. "We are honored to invite Dr. Eliza Harper, founder of Resilient Roots, keynote speaker at the National Children's Health Gala." An official invitation, a genuine honor. She had once dreamed of a day like this, but never imagined it would come so soon. Then her gaze stopped at the platinum sponsor section. Graham Wells and Savannah Rhodes. Clear, bold, unmistakable. For a brief moment, Eliza's heart skipped, not from anger, not from sorrow, but from the unmistakable pulse of truth. After 5 years of complete silence, they would now appear in the same room. She placed the letter down, leaned back in her chair, her fingers trembling slightly. Questions swirled in her mind. Would he recognize her? Would Savannah see the 5 children on that stage? Her children, their choir performance? Graham would see 5 faces reflecting pieces of himself. Eliza turned toward the nursery. The soft nightlight glowed under the door. 5 tiny bodies breathing in harmony. She exhaled, not out of fear, but because she understood. A new chapter was beginning, whether she was ready or not. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. Standing before the mirror, she slipped on the navy blue gown she had saved for a special occasion. She hugged her waist, now healed from childbirth. The fabric flowed elegantly over her shoulders. Not flashy, but dignified. Much like herself. Refined through fire, not fame. When Jason asked, "Mom, where are you going?" she knelt beside him and smoothed his hair. "I'm going to tell a story, an important one." Jason nodded. "I know. The story about your 5 kids, right?" She smiled. "Yes, and the mother who never gave up." The ballroom of the Grand Monarch Hotel shimmered like a miniature galaxy. Crystal chandeliers fractured golden light into 1,000 delicate shards, reflecting off glassware, silk gowns, and carefully curated smiles. Eliza entered that space with quiet poise. Her navy gule dress hugged her figure gracefully. Her hair was swept into a neat low bun, lips painted a soft wine red. Nothing extravagant, yet utterly captivating. She wasn't walking in as someone's ex-wife. She entered as a woman who had rebuilt herself from blood, tears, and 5 tiny heartbeats. Guests greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She offered polite smiles, firm handshakes with doctors, donors, and directors. Every nod acknowledged one truth. She was no longer in Graham Wells' shadow. She was her own light. From a corner of the hall, violin music flowed, elegant and soft. Then came a laugh, deep, familiar. It echoed like a ripple through water. Eliza paused. She didn't have to turn. Graham Wells was here. She rolled the glass of sparkling water in her palm, keeping her breath steady. When she finally turned, their eyes met. Graham stood among a group of investors, silver strands at his temples, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, the same polish, the same confidence, but something had shifted, a tiredness around his eyes, an absence behind his practiced smile. His gaze froze as it landed on her. Words died on his tongue. The air around them stilled while the world kept spinning. Eliza didn't look away. She offered a single nod. Brief, calm, a greeting that needed no words. Then she turned and walked, not hurried, not haunted, not waiting. Graham remained still, rooted in place as if her quiet dignity had turned his feet to stone. She moved toward the backstage corridor, where 5 little voices were rehearsing, waiting to sing. At the dining table, someone nudged Graham and asked, "Do you know her?" He placed his glass down, eyes still locked on the place where Eliza had disappeared. A long pause. Then he answered, barely audible, perhaps only to himself. "I thought I did." Graham had never imagined that a single song, just a few fleeting minutes on stage, could rip open a shell he'd spent 5 years fortifying. But as the 5 children began to sing, every expression, every glance, every tiny tilt of their heads or scrunch of their brows was a mirror of something deeply familiar. Jason, that steady, unblinking gaze, his own, from decades ago. Malia, the way she smiled like light bursting from inside, just like Graham's mother. Home is quietly supporting, never center stage, but always aware. Ella, eyes that seemed to be sketching the world, line by line. And Leanna, her joy wasn't learned, it was inherited. He didn't need DNA tests, didn't need official proof. He knew. But what shook him more than the resemblance was the realization of absence. These 5 lives had grown, laughed, cried without him. And the silence that once protected him now suffocated him. He had to see them again, not as a man escaping guilt, but as a father chasing redemption. He saw himself not in one child, but in all 5. His knees weakened. He sat back, hands trembling, heart pounding like it no longer belonged in his chest. He didn't blink, afraid that even a breath might erase what he had just seen. A few days after the gala, they met again, not under the glow of chandeliers, not among applause or admiration, but at a small park where Eliza often brought the children on weekends. That afternoon, the sun filtered gently through the trees, casting golden patterns over the damp grass. Eliza arrived first, seated on a worn wooden bench facing the playground. She wore a soft gray sweater, hair tied low, her gaze steady. She didn't come with hope, nor with resentment. She came with boundaries, clear and immovable. Graham arrived minutes later. He dressed simply, a navy sweater, jeans, and white sneakers, spotless. Not the polished CEO seen on magazine covers, but a man trying, perhaps for the first time, to be a father. He sat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Children's laughter echoed across the playground. Then Graham's voice broke the silence, hoarse, uneven. I cried all night after the gala, not from guilt, but because for the first time in years, I felt something real. Eliza, please let me be part of their lives. She turned to him, eyes neither soft nor sharp, measured. Her voice calm, firm. They're not a PR move, not a photo op. If you want to step into their world, you have to do it barefoot, slowly, carefully, with professional help, and never, ever try to steal their spotlight. Graham nodded, over and over, eyes glassy. I agree, I'll learn to be a father from the ground up. They sat in silence again, not 2 old lovers rebuilding, but 2 new people, laying the foundation for a path neither had ever walked. We're not doing this for each other, Eliza said. We're doing it for them. In the months that followed, Graham began to show up more often, quietly, without fanfare. Just a man clapping at the sidelines when Jason scored a goal. The one holding balloons at Leanna's birthday while she sang solo, slightly off key. The one taking photos at Ella's art show, where she displayed her first sketches. Each child welcomed him in their own way. Jason stayed silent but stood closer whenever Graham was near. Malia often asked, "Did you like the cake I made?" Tomas sat beside him, asking questions about robots. Ella said nothing for weeks, then left a drawing on his table. 2 adults, 5 children, holding hands. Liana called him Mr. Graham, and after 3 months changed it to Dad. Eliza never blogged about this, she kept it to herself. One night, with all 5 children asleep, she whispered into the quiet. This isn't a fairy tale ending, but it's the beginning of something real. And in this real beginning, she finally felt something she hadn't in years, peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she no longer had to pretend. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was simply living and loving, loudly, quietly, fully.